Hello all, and thank you for joining today's webinar. Today, we're going to be talking about IMPLAN's latest release of United States data, otherwise known as our core data, and talk about some of the changes that were implemented within our models from both the methodological and economic standpoints. My name is Wes Morgan, and I am one of the data developers here at IMPLAN. Today, I'll be joined by Dr. Jenny Montell, who is our chief economist and leader of the data team. Jenny and I are the staff that produced the US data, so we are very excited to get to speak with you all directly. All right, so on to today's agenda. Firstly, Jenny is going to go over production of our core data and some of the things that we do to bring it all together, including a description of how we incorporate some data that is only released periodically. Then she'll go over some methodological changes that were incorporated for this most recent year. And finally, I'll take back over and look into some of the changes in data in terms of real numbers that you can find in our recent data year release, and then we'll conclude. So with that, I'll hand it over to Jenny.
Great, thanks, Wes. Hello and welcome, everyone. Thank you for being with us today. As Wes noted, I'm going to start by highlighting a few key aspects of the annual data production process, after which I'll discuss a few important changes to those processes that we incorporated this year. Now, to start, I want to mention that at IMPLAN, we use over 100 raw data sets. And all of the raw data we use come from government agencies, and those data are publicly available. However, these public data sets require a lot of processing and enhancing. So I'm going to talk about some of that enhancing that we do, and I'm going to put it into two buckets. The first bucket is filling in gaps. And there are kind of three flavors of filling in the gaps that we do. So the first type is estimating non-disclosed values. Now, those are also known as suppressed values. And what that means is there will be a record in the table that we get, in the data table we get, that will tell us, for instance, that a particular industry exists in a region, and it might tell us how many establishments of that industry are in that region, but it will not tell us the number of employees that work there or the income they earn, for an example. So they're not giving us the full information about that industry in that region. And those are suppressed for privacy reasons. And so one of the biggest bits of value that we at IMPLAN add is estimating those missing values. And we do this with a variety of methods, and we have kind of tiers of preference for methods we use to estimate those numbers based on what other data we might have for that region or that industry, or what data we had last year for it, or for the state, for a larger geography or a more aggregate industry, whatever. We have a lot of methods we do for those, and those all can be found on our support site, by the way, all the methods we use for all the various data sets that we process. Okay, the next flavor of filling in the gaps is adjusting. Wes, you can go back if you wouldn't mind. I'm still on filling in the gaps. Adjusting for under coverage. And that is distinct from non-disclosed, because with under coverage, the data source is actually giving you a number. So it will tell you the number. It's not hiding the number from you, but we know that that value doesn't represent the entirety of that industry. So it either excludes certain types of workers or certain types of that industry's products. So a couple examples of this would be the Bureau of Labor Statistics Census of Employment and Wages data, or CEW data, where the CEW data excludes certain types of workers, like certain farm workers. It excludes railroad employees. It excludes student employees from the higher education industry. It excludes members of the military and even more. So we have to make adjustments to account for this. We have to boost up our number to a certain extent to fix for that under coverage. Another example is NOAA. We use their data for commercial fishing output, but their data do not provide full coverage of the Gulf states. So in that case, there's certain geographies that are undercovered instead of certain industries that are undercovered. And so we have to make adjustments for that. The third kind of flavor of filling in the gaps we do is estimating values where no raw data exists at all. In the big example of this is domestic trade, so the trade between states and counties of goods and services in the US. There's no raw data source for that, so we use a gravity model to estimate those. And then also most data elements for smaller geographies. So the smaller the geography, the fewer raw data elements are out there for it. So think of zip codes. But in IMPLAN, in an IMPLAN model, our zip code models have to have all the same data elements that our county level models have and that our state level models have. And so we have to come up with ways to estimate all those numbers that there aren't raw data for those smaller geographies. Okay, Wes, now I'm ready for the next kind of bucket of enhancing raw data, and I'll call this harmonization. So this is where we will put everything into the same year, because when we're producing our IMPLAN data, sometimes we have to use a raw data set that is lagged relative to the data year that we're producing. And so we do some projecting of certain data sets. We have to put everything into the same industry scheme. Almost all of our raw data sets come in a wide variety of levels of industry detail. And so we need to get those all together in the same IMPLAN industry scheme. And then of course we enforce industry and geographic roll-up such that if you were to sum all the values in IMPLAN's county level models, they would equal the values in the state level model for the state in which those counties exist. And then, of course, we do quality control testing along the way. We do it we don't just wait till the end and do a bunch of testing. We test after each data set that we process. We do quality control testing, and we do some manual replication in Excel where we hand estimate numbers based on what our automated programs are doing, and we make sure that our automated processes are working as expected. Okay, another note on the raw producing the annual data is the raw data release timeline. It spans over 6 months, so it's not like the government just dumps all the raw data on us in April and it takes us 6 months to process it. Really, why the process is so long is that the data release schedule spans that long. So we'll get some data in April. We'll process those. We'll do quality control checking on those. Then we get more data in May, which we process and quality control check, and then June, and so on and so forth. And the last piece of raw data that we used doesn't come out until September 30th. And then it takes us a few more weeks after that to process those and do all the harmonizing and final quality control checking. And so usually we're done with our process at the end of October. Okay, just a quick note that most of the raw data that we need is released annually. And so almost all of the elements that go into the IMPLAN models do have an annually updated raw value that we use. So industry data, commodity data, transfers data. However, there are a few data sets that only come out periodically. And go ahead, Wes. And so I've listed a few of them here. And the last two I put in bold because those are the ones of interest for us today, because they were incorporated into this latest release of IMPLAN core data. Now, some of you, and so I guess I'll talk about those in the next section. So I'll wait for my details till we move on the slides. And so let's talk about those two that were incorporated this year. The first one that I'm going to talk about is the Census of State and Local Government Finances. These data include government revenues, government expenditures, and intergovernmental transfers. And we use these for a lot of things in our IMPLAN models, of course, because we have all the information about governments in there, as well as industries and households and all of that. But why the census is so important is because these data are used to fill in gaps in the annual survey of state and local government finances. So the annual survey of state and local government finances, as the name suggests, comes out annually, and it has all these same information on government revenues, expenditures, and transfers. However, as the name suggests, it's a survey, and so it doesn't cover all the units of government in the US. And therefore, we need to, for those units of government that aren't covered in a given year, we use projected numbers from the latest census of state and local government finances to help us fill in those gaps. So it's great that we got the census this year, so we have updated information to be filling in those gaps from the annual survey. And just a quick note that the new census and subsequent surveys, annual surveys, do incorporate several changes. Now, most IMPLAN users are not going to notice or care about any of those changes because they really occur at more detailed level than are exposed in an IMPLAN model. But these changes will be reflected in the intermediate step tax data that we publish in Data Library. So any of you who aren't familiar with Data Library, it's where we house our data spanning back to 2001 up to the current IMPLAN data year, all in the same sectoring scheme, so you can do time series analysis on it. But it also includes a couple additional data sets that aren't in an IMPLAN model, like the fully disclosed CEW data from BLS, and these tax data where we show by individual unit of government all the very, very specific types of taxes and fees and things, expenditures they made for that year. So if you are a consumer of our tax data in Data Library, you will want to familiarize yourself with the changes that were incorporated into the census and the subsequent surveys. And we have those summarized in our IMPLAN data release notes. And in those release notes, we also have a link to more details from the Census Bureau. All right, the other bit of periodic raw data that we incorporated this year is the zip code level data from the Census of Agriculture. So some of you might know that most of the Census of Agriculture data for the states and counties came out last year, and we incorporated that into last year's IMPLAN data. It's just the zip code level data that came out this year. And what we use from the Census of Agriculture for zip codes is farm counts by zip code and farm sector. And we use those to help distribute out county level farm sector data to zip codes. So output, employment, things like that. Okay, and on to other changes that were incorporated this year. We'll now talk about some methodological changes. And the first of these was forced upon us because the Bureau of Economic Analysis discontinued some data tables from their product regional economic accounts. The first set of those tables that were discontinued were employment tables. And they're listed here: state level total employment by industry, state level wage and salary employment by industry, and then county level total employment by industry. The BEA has never published any county level wage and salary employment by industry. So that just never existed. So to be clear, BEA is now not publishing any employment numbers at all. And this is problematic to us for two reasons. The first is that this was our only source of proprietor counts. So, and this is because total employment minus wage and salary employment is proprietors. And so this was our only source of proprietor count information. And CEW does not include proprietors. This was also our only source for complete counts of wage and salary employment. If you remember from a few slides ago where I said that we have to make adjustments for CEW because it undercovers some industries, because it excludes some types of employees. Well, part of how we adjusted for those undercoverages was comparing the CEW data to these BEA REA data. When we aggregated the CEW data into the same sectoring scheme as BEA and or REA, and we got them in, compared the same years, because REA data are lagged a year relative to the CEW data, but we could make those comparisons and we could understand what kind of adjustments we needed to make to the CEW data. So we have had to come up with new methods and new data sources, including data from the IRS. And we've written an article called Replacement for Discontinued BEA REA Data. And if you just search for that title on our support site, which is support.implan.com, you will be able to access that article where we really go into lots of details of exactly what our methods are to replace these REA data. Okay, the next method, the BEA REA data also discontinued this table that gives us county level transfer payments to households. And we use these as distributors to distribute some national level transfer payments to households down to the state and county level. And now we're just using alternative methods and data from a different BEA table and called the economic profile. And those details are also included in that same article I mentioned from the last slide. So if you're interested, you can find out more information. Thanks, Wes. Okay, next set of methodological changes have to do with farm sector improvements. We did two different improvements to farm sectors. The first one has to do with employment and employee compensation. As we've mentioned a couple times, CEW data doesn't fully cover the farm sectors, only covers about 90% of farm sector wage and salary, employment, and wages. So our previous use of CEW for farm sectors was only to use CEW data indirectly, along with BEA input-output tables to get ratios of wage and salary employment per output. And then we apply those ratios to the annual output data we get from USDA, ERS, and NAS. So we're still doing that, but we're now adding an additional use of CEW. If CEW data undercover farm sector wage and salary, employment, and wages, then they therefore must be the minimum value. And so now we're incorporating CEW values as a minimum to make sure that our estimates based on this method here of using these ratios applied to annual output numbers, we want to make sure that those estimates give us at least as much employment as CEW shows, and at least as much employee compensation as CEW is showing for wages. So this is just a slight improvement, making sure we're not underestimating farm sector employment. And we are only doing this when the CEW value is fully disclosed by the BLS and not estimated by us. The second farm sector improvement has to do with output. We have discovered a new value that we weren't aware of before that we can use as a control total for the US for the sum of all farm sectors. There is a table from the BEA National Income and Product Accounts series that gives us total farm output. So this doesn't give us any sector detail or any geographic detail, but by forcing our US value to that value, it will trickle down to states and counties and all the various farm industries, since we do have that geographic roll up. So all geographies will roll up to this farm output value that we're now using. Thanks, Wes. Now, finally, some of you might be familiar with the Shannon-Weaver index that IMPLAN has had around for a while. It is a measure of economic diversity that is based on, or takes into account, the number of industries in a region and how evenly spread out or not employment is among those industries. It ranges from 0 to 1, with 1 being perfect diversity, where all industries exist and employment is perfectly distributed across all those industries. Now, of course, no place in the world actually like that actually exists, but that is the maximum. And this is a data point that is in data library, so you can find it there. And historically, we have calculated it using total employment, which is the sum of wage and salary employment and proprietors. However, proprietor data, proprietor counts, are based on the location of the proprietor's residence, so where the proprietor lives, which can be different from the location of the business activity. So an owner of a business can live somewhere else, somewhere different than where the activity is happening. So this can skew the Shannon-Weaver index calculations in cases where an industry exists in a region only because proprietors live there. And so it makes comparisons across geographies kind of iffy. So we are now calculating the Shannon-Weaver index using wage and salary employment only, and that should improve comparisons over geographies. All right, now I'll hand it over to Wes to actually look at some of the new data.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Jenny. Really appreciate that. I'm going to go ahead and dive into some of the changes that we saw in the raw numbers in our data. So firstly, we just wanted to talk about some of the shifts that occur due to just being typical structural changes. So we're going to look at a couple of different reasons why economic data might change, and this is going to be the first. So for example, what households and we as consumers demand does fluctuate year over year typically. Between 2023 and 2024, which is the year that our most recent data is based on, demand for retail services saw some major changes, with large increases in demand for electronics and appliances, sporting goods and hobby supplies, and furniture and home furnishings. These values that you're seeing on your screen right now are all adjusted for inflation, so we can be certain that the change in demand is reflective of consumer spending patterns rather than just increases in price. On the flip side, other retail services saw sharp drops in demand. For example, miscellaneous store retailers saw about a 56% decrease in demand from households. So this is really just kind of to illustrate the idea that data can change year over year simply because of how we as consumers spend and interact with our economy. Very similarly, imports of commodities can fluctuate quite a bit. Funnily enough, the 3 commodities listed here, which are non-ferrous forgings, all other petroleum and coal products, and iron and steel forgings, are all top contenders for increases in foreign imports and have certainly been at top of mind for people in the US lately, just given the news cycle and impending tariffs. Now, the tariff situations that we're all hearing about in the news are not yet reflected in this data because, again, it's based on 2024. But once the 2025 data comes out, rolls around, and we're able to incorporate those changes, then we'll be able to see how these numbers change. And it'll be interesting to track that kind of a thing. Okay, so that kind of is a nice segue into the next reason that economic data might change. And one of the most important reasons is policy, changes in policy. So to illustrate this type of a change, I chose the CHIPS and Science Act as an example. This legislation was passed in 2022, but most of its core consequences were meant to come into effect through 2023 and 2024. The most immediate and visible effect that we would expect to see would be an increase in spending on manufacturing construction. So we took a look at the construction of new manufacturing structures in this year's data and last. So that's output for industry 46, and we did indeed see large increases across the board. Every single state in the US experienced positive growth in output for this industry. In fact, the US as a whole saw a 59% increase in output for this industry. This graph shows increases for each state as well as for the US, with New Hampshire displaying the highest growth in output for this industry at 107% growth. Again, I will mention that these percent changes do account for inflation. Without controlling for that, we would have been looking at 65% growth for the US and 115% growth for New Hampshire. Now, this is not to say that this act, the CHIPS and Science Act, is the only reason that we see this kind of growth, but it certainly does contribute, and we want to just make sure that what we're seeing kind of matches our expectations. New Hampshire in particular stood out, so we really wanted to investigate that specifically. And again, we're just trying to make sure that things that we see in our data jive with our expectations according to news sources around this policy in question. Indeed, we would expect to see an outsized impact in this state, as the Biden administration awarded $35 million in federal incentives for BAE systems there. That was the first grant chosen, and it was kind of a symbolic start to implementation of this act. Those funds are intended to modernize and expand the Microelectronics Center in Nashua. That's a DoD-accredited foundry that produces specialized chips for military programs. And these funds are intended to quadruple the production capacity of that plant. So the construction industry for new manufacturing structures is exactly where we were expecting to see growth. And that's exactly what we saw. Now, as with most policy, economic impacts are usually going to unfold in stages. So for example, we would expect to see an increase in construction for plants first, and then increases to the operations of those plants later on. Even with that being the case, we are already seeing some increases in output for the relevant industries that this construction is aimed at bolstering. So you can see on your screen here that the two relevant industries that might operate in such plants have already seen some growth in output and employee compensation as well, though the employee compensation lift is a little bit smaller. Okay, another reason that we might see shifts in economic data are for environmental reasons. So when we compared the 2023 data to the 2024 data, we expected to see effects of large-scale environmental shifts that we see year to year. For example, in 2023, we saw a massive drought and heat wave in the southern and midwestern parts of the United States, which caused over $14.5 billion in damages. That occurred in states like Texas, Louisiana, Michigan, Oklahoma, Kansas, Nebraska, and Alabama. Louisiana in particular saw the greatest coverage of exceptional drought, to which 74.2% of the state was subjected in November of 2023. So as a result, we would expect to see changes to our agricultural industries due to decreases in crop yields and early sell-offs. And indeed, our 2024 data shows an 8% increase in output across all agricultural industries for 2024, meaning that those industries did recover some from one year to the next. Another example of an environmental impact kind of making a bit of an appearance in our data. In 2024, Florida, Georgia, North Carolina, South Carolina, Tennessee, and Virginia were all affected by the tragedies of Hurricanes Milton and Helene, which caused over $100 billion in damages in those states. Consequently, each of these states saw a rise in construction output, specifically including construction of residential structures and construction for infrastructure, industries like construction of highways and bridges. This is all output generated by the need to rebuild, or at least some of it is certainly generated by the need to rebuild and repair damages that were caused. Not to mention the impact that this will likely have in the future for insurance industries in hard-hit areas. Again, these events are not the only contributors for changes to industry growth, and they're certainly restricted by time. For example, more recently, environmentally based economic impacts, such as those caused by something like the Los Angeles wildfires of 2025, won't be taken into account here. But overall, these kind of impacts, they do match expectations that we have of our data. This also serves as a reminder that context is super important for economic impact studies, and whenever you're looking at economic data, as not all economic growth really is representing a positive influence in our communities. You just have to be mindful of kind of the story that you're trying to tell beyond just the dollars in your economic impact data and studies. Okay, on the more cheery side, another really interesting reason that there might be changes in output would be due to changes in technology. So artificial intelligence has been a hot topic for a while now. So we thought it'd be interesting to look at some of the industries that are really driving that adoption of AI. Industries that belong to the grouping of professional, scientific, and technical services are really big proponents of AI adoption. And indeed, we saw positive growth for all of them at the US level in IMPLAN's data. Overall growth in output grew by about 4%, while overall growth in output per wage and salary worker, which grew by about 7.5%. The other computer-related services industry, which is number 443 here on this list, that had standout growth of about 25% for output and 21% for productivity for output per worker. So it's pretty neat to see. Additionally, we took a look at growth in wage and salary employment itself, comparing jobs that are more exposed to AI versus jobs that are less exposed. So when I say more exposed, I'm talking about jobs that involve high volume of data analysis, documentation, financial transactions, communication, or just cognitive tasks that are augmentable or automatable by AI technologies. So when we're talking about more exposed, we're talking about industries like financial services, professional and scientific services, industries like tech and data and publishing, that kind of thing. The less exposed industries are those that involve direct physical labor or environmental variability, face-to-face service, things that AI can't automate or really help with. So those are industries like healthcare, agriculture, mining, construction, hospitality, and other things like that. When looking at the employment growth year over year total for all these industries, kind of sorted into those two blocks of more exposed versus less exposed, we saw that more exposed jobs actually had a small decrease in employment, while industries that are less exposed saw a slight increase. So all of this is to say that growth in more exposed jobs is slower than growth in less exposed jobs, which is exactly what sources like Bureau of Labor Statistics have been predicting will be the long-term trend. Just because AI augmentation might mean that in these industries, you don't need to hire as many people. AI is helping them do their job, is helping increase productivity, so there is less need for employees. I'll also note this is a pretty general slide, as there's always going to be job demand in every industry, and we need to keep in mind that a wide variety of jobs exists within each industry. So for example, if you're thinking about a less exposed industry like construction, there are definitely going to be some record keeping or administrative jobs that could be augmented with AI, and they are actually more exposed, even though the industry in this kind of general study that I did is classified as a less exposed one. Not everyone in that industry is going to be doing manual labor. So one thing that's really nice about IMPLAN, and it's kind of cool, is that we have occupation employment breakouts. So we can actually take a look not just at the industry level, but also at the occupation level for these types of investigations. When I sorted all of the jobs that IMPLAN has in its occupation data and looked at more exposed versus less exposed by occupation, by industry, then we can see that this same trend still holds. So less exposed jobs grew at a faster rate year over year than jobs that are more exposed to AI in the United States when comparing 2023 to 2024 data. In fact, using occupation data as a lens revealed that both types of jobs are growing. In IMPLAN's occupation data, every industry has its own mix of occupations, and not every single occupation exists within each industry. So that's how you can get the positives on this slide and then a negative on the prior slide. Employee compensation also exhibited that same trend, though the difference isn't too stark. This is just one of the examples of the types of studies that can be completed when pairing our satellite accounts data with our core data, and hopefully it illustrates the importance of using the most recent data available. So you as analysts can mark these types of trends. While changes due to the structure of the economy or the structure of data or the methodologies that we use, or changes coming from environmental impacts or policy or technology, all those things, they don't encompass every single reason why things might look different from one year to the next, but they are certainly important and are reflected by IMPLAN's data as we update it each and every year. So just really important to use the most recent data. Okay, so that covers the content for our webinar today. We really appreciate you all joining, and I hope you have a great rest of your day. Thanks.
Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.